Please help me! She is trying to kill me!
She is just confused. Shut your mouth right now.
What is going on here? Get away from my mother right now!
Rain came down on the truck windshield so hard that the wipers gave up trying to fight it. And through that smeared gray sheet of water, Marcus Bellamy saw the shape of his own house the way a man sees something in a nightmare. He already knows the ending too. He was 3 hours early. The job site had flooded out before noon. The foreman sent everybody home, and all Marcus had wanted was a hot shower and the smell of his wife's cooking. Instead, he sat in his driveway with the engine ticking and stared through the front window at his living room, where his wife Nadia was down on the floor with both hands wrapped around his mother's wrists, pill bottles scattered across the rug like spilled teeth, and his mother's mouth stretched open in a scream he could not hear through the glass and the rain. Ophelia's eyes swung to the window. They found her son, and her lips moved around 2 words he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Help me. Everything Marcus Bellamy believed about the woman he had married, and about the mother who had raised him, was about to be turned completely inside out. But not in the way he thought sitting in that truck. Not in the way you think either. Because the thing about the truth is that it doesn't always arrive when you go looking for it. Sometimes it hides in plain sight for months, wearing a familiar face, speaking in a voice you've trusted your whole life. And by the time you finally see it for what it is, you've already burned down everything that mattered. That is the story of what happened in that house on Marlowe Street. Stay with me, because the woman screaming for help on that floor was not the victim, and the man about to charge through that front door was about to make the worst mistake of his life. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let me take you back. Not to the storm, not yet, but to the version of Marcus Bellamy that existed before any of this, because you can't understand how far a man falls until you've seen him standing tall. Marcus was 45 years old, a construction foreman with shoulders that filled a doorway and hands that had laid brick and poured foundation across half of Charlotte's East Side. He was not a man of many words. His own father used to say that Marcus talked with his hands and listened with his whole body, and that was true. When Marcus loved you, he showed it by fixing your car, by patching your roof before the season turned, by showing up at 6 in the morning without being asked. He did not know how to say the soft things out loud. That, as it turned out, was the crack that ran all the way down through the foundation of everything, though nobody could have seen it at the time. He'd met Nadia Okafor 6 years before that storm, and if you'd asked him, he'd have told you plainly that she was the best thing that ever walked into his life. Nadia was an ICU nurse at Novant Health, 41. The kind of woman who could work a 14-hour shift holding a stranger's hand while their monitors flatlined, and still come home with enough tenderness left over to rub her husband's aching back without being asked. She wore her hair pinned up off her neck because the ward was always too warm, and she laughed with her whole face. And in the early years of their marriage, that laugh came easy and often. They had married in a small ceremony behind Greater Faith Baptist, danced badly in their own kitchen to a radio that only got 2 stations clearly, and saved every spare dollar toward the brick 2-story on Marlowe Street that they finally, proudly, closed on the spring Marcus turned 42. It was not a mansion. It was theirs. And for a while, it was happy. I want you to hold on to that image of them, because it matters. I want you to see Nadia coming home from a night shift, kicking off her shoes at the door, and Marcus already up making her eggs because he knew she couldn't sleep on an empty stomach. I want you to see the way he watched her when she wasn't looking, like a man who couldn't quite believe his luck. Because when the accusations came, when the whole neighborhood turned its back on this woman, you're going to be tempted to forget that this is who she really was. The people around them forgot. That was the tragedy. And it started, the way so many tragedies do, with a death in the family. Samuel Bellamy, Marcus's father, passed on a cold Tuesday morning in the 3rd year of their marriage. His heart simply stopped while he was reading the newspaper in his chair, and by the time the ambulance came there was nothing anyone could do. Marcus took it the way strong, quiet men often take the loss of the fathers they modeled themselves on. He didn't cry at first. He organized. He handled the arrangements. He called the relatives. He stood at the funeral in his one good suit with his jaw locked, so tight you could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. It wasn't until the church had emptied out, until it was just him and the closed casket and the smell of lilies, that his knees finally buckled. Nadia caught him. She always caught him. And it was there, with his hand pressed flat against the polished wood, that Marcus made a promise to his dead father that he would spend the next 2 years keeping at the cost of everything else. I'll take care of Mama. I swear it. You don't have to worry about her. His mother, Ophelia Bellamy, sat in the front pew that whole time looking like a woman who had been hollowed out. 72 years old, silver hair pinned beneath a black hat, hands folded so still in her lap they might have been carved. The congregation of Greater Faith Baptist loved Ophelia. She had sung in that choir for 30 years, brought pound cake to every funeral repast, sat with the sick and prayed with the grieving. When she wept quietly into her handkerchief that day, half the church wept with her. She was, by every account anyone could give you, a good Christian woman who had just lost the husband of 50 years. And I need you to understand that this was not entirely a performance. Her grief was real. Her love for Samuel was real. That's what made everything that came after so hard for anyone to see. The most dangerous lies are the ones built on a foundation of something true. It was Nadia who suggested Ophelia move in with them. I want to be very clear about that, because it becomes important later. Nobody pressured her. Nobody guilt her into it. Marcus was worried about his mother living alone in that big, empty house across town. And one evening Nadia set down her fork at dinner and said, gently, "Marcus, she shouldn't be by herself right now. Bring her here. We've got the room. I'd rather she be where I can look after her." That was the kind of woman Nadia was. A nurse to the bone. She spent her working life caring for strangers, and it never once occurred to her to do less for her own husband's mother. She opened her home. She opened her heart. And in doing so, without knowing it, she opened the door to her own undoing. The move happened over a weekend in early autumn. Marcus rented a truck. A couple of men from his crew came to help, and by Sunday evening Ophelia's belongings had been carried up into the spare bedroom that Nadia had spent the whole week preparing. New curtains, fresh linens, a little reading lamp because she'd remembered Ophelia liked to read her devotionals before bed. Nadia had thought of everything. And Ophelia stood in the doorway of that carefully prepared room, looked around at all of it, and said, "Well, isn't this nice?" Just 3 words. But there was something underneath them that Nadia felt more than heard. A coolness, a measuring quality, like a woman appraising a room she intended to occupy for a long time. Nadia told herself she was imagining it. She was tired from the move, and grief made people strange. And this was her husband's mother, for heaven's sake. She pushed the feeling down. That was the first of many times she would talk herself out of trusting her own instincts, and every single time, she would be wrong to do it. The first few weeks were fine. Better than fine, even. Ophelia was pleasant, complimentary, easy to have around. She praised Nadia's cooking, folded laundry without being asked, told Marcus over dinner how blessed he was to have found such a hard-working wife. Marcus would beam at that, reach across the table and squeeze Nadia's hand. And for those first weeks the house on Marlowe Street held 3 people who seemed, by every visible sign, to be a family. But there was a pattern forming underneath the surface, a pattern so slow and so subtle that even Nadia, watching it happen to her own life, couldn't name it until it was far too late. The warmth Ophelia showed came only when Marcus was in the room. The moment he left for work, something in the old woman's face would close like a door. At first it was small enough to dismiss. Nadia would make lunch, leave it covered on the counter, and go up to sleep after a night shift, and when she came back down the food would be untouched, and Ophelia would say she hadn't been hungry. Fine. Old people ate less. But then Ophelia started telling Marcus, in that soft, wounded voice of hers, that she'd gone without lunch again because nobody had thought to feed her. Not a lie exactly. A rearrangement of the truth, a shifting of the facts just far enough to leave a bruise. Marcus would come to Nadia confused, hurt on his mother's behalf, and Nadia would explain that she'd left food right there on the counter, and Ophelia would blink her wet eyes and say she must have forgotten. She was just an old, forgetful woman. They shouldn't mind her. And somehow, every time, Nadia came out of it looking either neglectful or like she was calling a grieving widow a liar. There was no way to win. That was the design of it, though Nadia didn't understand yet that it was a design at all. The thing you have to understand about what Ophelia was doing is that none of it, taken alone, amounted to anything you could point at. A forgotten lunch. A misremembered conversation. A comment made just quiet enough that only Nadia heard the edge in it. If Nadia had gone to Marcus and said, "Your mother is doing something to me," what would she even have said? That the woman was too polite? That she praised her cooking in front of him and ignored it behind his back? It sounded insane even in Nadia's own head. And that, precisely, was the trap. Ophelia had constructed a situation in which the truth itself sounded like paranoia. Every drop of poison was administered in a dose too small to prove and too frequent to ignore, and slowly, day by day, week by week, the woman who had opened her home out of pure kindness began to feel like a stranger in it. Nadia started sleeping worse. She'd come off a brutal shift, 3 codes in one night, a young mother she couldn't save, and instead of the rest she needed, she'd lie in bed cataloging the day's small wounds, trying to figure out if she was losing her mind. She stopped mentioning things to Marcus, because every time she did, it turned into her seeming ungrateful, and she could see how much he needed to believe his mother was at peace under his roof. He had made a promise to a casket. Nadia understood that promise. She loved him for it. So she swallowed the little cruelties one after another and told herself it would settle down once the grief eased, and she watched her husband come home each evening to a mother who lit up like a lamp the second his key turned in the lock, and she said nothing. She was, without realizing it, teaching him that everything was fine. She would come to regret that silence more than almost anything. Then came the watch. Samuel's gold pocket watch, the one thing Ophelia claimed to treasure above all his possessions, the watch his own father had carried, the watch she said she wanted to give to Marcus one day, so a piece of Samuel would live on. One morning it was gone, and the house on Marlowe Street, which had been holding its tension so quietly for weeks, finally cracked wide open. Ophelia wept. She tore through her room. She asked had anyone seen it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands shaking and said that watch was the only thing she had left of the man she'd loved for 50 years, and now even that was taken from her. Marcus was beside himself. He searched the whole house. He questioned everyone gently, then less gently. 3 days this went on. 3 days of an old woman grieving a lost heirloom. And the whole time Nadia had a cold, sick feeling she couldn't explain, a sense that she was standing on ground that was about to give way beneath her. It gave way on the 4th day. Marcus found the watch in Nadia's nightstand drawer, tucked beneath a folded scarf, exactly where a guilty person might hide something they'd stolen. He stood in their bedroom holding it in his open palm, and when Nadia walked in and saw what he was holding, the color drained right out of her face. "I never touched that watch," she said. "Marcus, I have never opened your mother's things. I swear to God I've never even held that watch." And she was telling the truth. I need you to know she was telling the absolute truth, because she was. But the watch was right there, in her drawer, under her scarf, and truth is a fragile thing when it's standing next to physical evidence. Marcus looked at his wife, and for the first time in 6 years, a small terrible seed of doubt took root behind his eyes. He wanted to believe her. Everything he knew about the woman he'd married told him to believe her. But the watch was in her drawer. Now, here is what neither of them saw, and here is why I've asked you to stay close. 3 nights before Marcus found that watch, While Nadia lay dead asleep after a double shift, a pair of hands slid open that nightstand drawer in the dark. Careful hands. Patient hands. They lifted the scarf, laid the gold watch beneath it, smoothed the fabric back into place, and eased the drawer shut without a sound. And then those hands' owner stood over the sleeping woman for a long, quiet moment before returning down the hall to her own room, to lie awake in the dark with the small, satisfied stillness of someone who has just set a trap and has nothing to do now but wait for it to spring. You know whose hands those were. Nadia didn't. Marcus didn't. And that is the difference between you and the man standing in that bedroom holding the watch, because you can see the whole board, and he could only see the piece that had been placed for him to find. By the time the leaves had finished falling that year, the thing that had started as a forgotten lunch had grown into something with real weight to it. Marcus had begun watching his wife differently. Not cruelly, not yet, but with a wariness that hadn't been there before, a hesitation before he trusted what she told him. And Ophelia, for her part, had discovered exactly how much she could accomplish with a soft voice and a wounded expression and the unshakable credibility of a church-going widow. She had learned that in any contest between the grieving mother and the tired wife, the mother would win every time. She had tested it, and it had held. So she began to reach for more. Ophelia's next move was patient, and it was aimed at the one place where her word carried more weight than anyone else's on earth. She started going back to Wednesday night service. That in itself was nothing to remark on, a widow returning to the comfort of her congregation, and the people of Greater Faith Baptist welcomed her back with open arms and covered dishes. But Ophelia did not come back to that church only to worship. She came back to build something, and what she came to build was a story, told in fragments, to the one audience guaranteed to carry it further than she ever could herself. She would arrive a little tired. She would wave off concern with a brave little smile. And when Sister Della Mabry, who had known Ophelia 40 years and loved gossip the way some people love sugar, asked how she was settling in over on Marlowe Street, Ophelia would let a silence hang just a beat too long before saying, "Oh, I don't want to be any trouble to those young people. I'm sure I'm just in the way." That was all it took. Sister Della's imagination did the rest, and Sister Della had the most active mouth in 3 counties. Within a month, the whispers had made their way around the fellowship hall, like water, finding the low places. Poor Ophelia, living with that daughter-in-law who worked all those night hours. You know those career women don't have time for an old woman. Somebody heard she goes hungry over there. Somebody heard worse. And Ophelia never once said any of it directly. She didn't have to. She had learned that a well-placed silence, a lowered gaze, a hand pressed to the chest, as if suppressing some private pain, could accomplish everything a direct accusation could and leave no fingerprints at all. She was, in her quiet way, an artist. It's just that her medium was other people's trust, and her canvas was the reputation of a woman who had never done anything but try to love her. Then the bruises appeared. The first one Marcus noticed was on his mother's forearm, a yellowing mark the size of a thumbprint, and when he asked about it, she pulled her sleeve down quickly and said it was nothing. She'd bruised easy at her age. She'd bumped it on the cabinet. But she said it in a way that made it sound like she was covering for someone. The second bruise, a week later, was harder to explain away, a darker mark near her wrist, and this time when Marcus asked, Ophelia's eyes filled and she said, "Please, baby, just leave it alone. I don't want to cause problems in your marriage." And there it was. She hadn't accused Nadia of a single thing. She had done something far more devastating. She had defended her. She had made herself into a woman so gentle and so long-suffering that she would rather bear her injuries in silence than speak against the wife of the son she loved. It was masterful. And it was a lie stitched together out of marks she had pressed into her own skin in the privacy of her room, pressing her old thumbs into the thin flesh of her arms until the blood rose beneath, because she had figured out that a bruise you cannot explain is worth more than 100 accusations you have to defend. Pastor Elias Grant came to the house on a Sunday afternoon. He was a good man, understand, 60-some years old, a genuine shepherd who had buried and married and counseled that congregation for the better part of 3 decades, and he did not come to Marlowe Street looking to condemn anyone. He came because a woman he'd known and respected for years appeared to be suffering, and because that woman's church family had grown quietly, deeply worried. He sat in Marcus's living room with a glass of sweet tea he barely touched, and he chose his words with the care of a man walking on ice. "Marcus," he said, "I've known your mother a long time, and I've watched her get quieter these last months. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but son, I have to ask you man to man, is everything all right in your home?" Marcus felt the floor tilt under him. Because his pastor, the most trusted voice in his world outside his own father, was sitting in his living room asking him a question that only made sense if the whispers were true. And Marcus, God help him, had already been given a watch in a drawer and 2 unexplained bruises and 100 small doubts, and now the man of God was giving those doubts a shape and a name. Nadia felt the neighborhood turn before she understood why. It was in the way conversation stopped when she pushed her cart into the grocery store on Franklin. It was in the way the women from the church who used to wave now found somewhere else to look. It was in a phone call from her sister Renee, who said, carefully, "Nadia, what is going on over there? Because people are saying things about you, and they're ugly things, and I need to hear from you what's true." And Nadia stood in her own kitchen, the kitchen she and Marcus had danced in, and realized that a story was being told about her all over town, a story in which she was a monster, and she had no idea who was telling it or how to make it stop. She only knew that at the center of it, somehow, was the frail, grieving woman upstairs whom everyone loved and no one suspected, and that if Nadia said so out loud to a single living soul, she would sound exactly like a guilty woman trying to blame her victim. The marriage was going under, and both of them could feel it. There was a dinner. I want to tell you about this dinner, because it was the night the last of the ground gave way. It was just the 2 of them, Ophelia having gone up early with a headache, and Nadia had reached the end of what she could carry in silence. She set down her fork and she told Marcus the truth as plainly as she knew how. "Your mother is doing something to us," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to prove it to you, but she is not the woman she is when you're in the room. She turns it off the second you leave. The food, the watch, these bruises, Marcus, I have never in my life laid a hand on your mother, and something in my gut is telling me she is doing this to herself and letting everyone believe it's me." And she watched her husband's face as she said it, and she watched him hear it, and she watched him decide he could not accept it. Because to accept it, Marcus would have had to believe that his grieving mother, the woman his dead father had asked him to protect, was capable of a cruelty so cold it defied imagination. It was easier, so much easier, to believe that his exhausted wife had cracked under the pressure. "Don't," he said, low and hard. "Don't you dare say that about my mother. She just lost her husband. She's got nobody left but us, and you're accusing her of, what, hurting herself to frame you? Do you hear yourself?" He slept downstairs that night, and the distance between them, once opened, would not close on its own. Renee begged her to leave. Over the phone, late at night, Nadia's younger sister pleaded with her to pack a bag and come stay in her spare room until things cooled down. "This isn't your fault, and it isn't your job to stand there and take it," Renee said. "Come here. Let him figure out on his own what he's losing." But Nadia wouldn't go, partly because she still loved him, and partly out of a stubbornness that ran bone deep, and partly because some quiet, clear-eyed part of her understood that the moment she walked out that door, she would be handing Ophelia the final proof of everything. The guilty flee. If Nadia left, the story would write its own ending. So she stayed in a house that had turned against her, in a marriage growing colder by the day, and she made a decision that would eventually save her life, though it would first make everything so much worse. She was a nurse, and a nurse does not guess. A nurse observes and documents, and looks for the thing that doesn't add up. What didn't add up was the medication. Ophelia was on a regimen for her heart and her blood pressure, and Nadia, out of professional habit as much as care, had always kept a loose eye on it. And in those hard weeks, Nadia began to notice things that troubled the clinician in her. Ophelia would appear foggy and confused in front of Marcus, unsteady, her words thick, exactly the presentation of a frail woman being neglected or worse. But at other moments, when she thought no one was watching, she moved through the house with a steadiness and a sharpness that a genuinely declining woman simply does not have. Nadia started paying closer attention to the pill organizer, and she came to a conclusion that made her blood run cold. Ophelia wasn't taking her heart medication reliably at all. She was palming it, tucking the tablets into a tissue, and instead she was asking her doctor and asking Marcus for something to help her sleep, sedatives, more and more of them. The very things that would make an old woman seem drugged and helpless and confused in front of a worried son. She was manufacturing her own decline. She was building a body of evidence, and that body was her own. That was the moment Nadia understood she was not dealing with grief or forgetfulness, or the ordinary friction of a hard living situation. She was dealing with a plan, a patient, deliberate plan, executed by someone with nothing but time and a lifetime's understanding of exactly which strings to pull. And a plan that elaborate, Nadia realized, had a purpose. It was building toward something. She just couldn't see what yet. What she could see was that she was completely alone, that her husband had stopped believing her, that her church and her neighbors had already convicted her, and that if whatever was coming actually arrived, she would have not one shred of proof that she wasn't exactly the villain everyone had decided she was. And so she did the thing that would eventually turn the whole story inside out. She drove to an electronics store 2 towns over, where nobody knew her face, and she bought a small home camera, the kind people use to check on a baby or a dog, and she brought it home and set it on the living room bookshelf between a ceramic angel and a row of Marcus's father's old paperbacks, angled out across the room, and she told herself it was in case Ophelia fell and needed help when no one was home. That was half the truth. The other half she didn't say even to herself. Remember that camera. Everything comes back to that camera. The storm rolled in on a Thursday. Marcus left for the job site before dawn, kissed nobody goodbye because he and Nadia were barely speaking, and Nadia herself left an hour later for a hospital shift, so that by mid-morning Ophelia had the house on Marlowe Street entirely to herself. And here is where I have to tell you what happened in that living room. The real version. The version only the camera on the bookshelf recorded, because the version Marcus saw through the rain-streaked window was a lie built specifically for him to walk into. Nadia's shift got canceled. A water main had failed near the hospital, and they'd sent the non-essential staff home, and Nadia texted no one, just drove back through the gathering storm, and came in through the kitchen door around the same time the rain began to come down in earnest. She found her mother-in-law in the living room, and she found her standing on a dining chair, reaching up toward the high shelf, steady as a woman 30 years younger, doing something with her free hand near the bookshelf that Nadia couldn't quite make out. When Ophelia heard the kitchen door, everything changed in an instant. The steadiness vanished. The old woman folded down into her frail, confused self, and by the time Nadia came around the corner, Ophelia was on the floor beside her overturned pill organizer, tablets scattered everywhere, beginning to moan as if she'd fallen. Nadia did what any nurse would do, what any decent human being would do. She dropped to the floor and took hold of her mother-in-law to keep her from thrashing and hurting herself worse, checking her over, talking to her in the calm, low voice she used with frightened patience, asking her where it hurt. That was the position. That was the exact and innocent position, hands on Ophelia's wrist to steady her, pills across the rug, when Ophelia's whole body suddenly went rigid and she began to scream. Not a scream of pain. A scream aimed like a weapon, thrown at the window, because Ophelia, from her place on the floor, had heard what Nadia had not over the noise of the storm. She had heard Marcus's truck pull into the driveway 3 hours early, and she understood, in a flash of terrible improvisation, that the thing she had been building toward for months had just been handed to her, gift-wrapped, by the weather. So she screamed, and she twisted her wrists in Nadia's steadying hands so that it looked like a struggle, and she turned her face to the window where she knew her son was about to appear, and when his white shocked face swam up out of the rain, she looked her only child dead in the eyes and mouthed the two words that would end his marriage. "Help me. You already know what Marcus did. He came through that front door like the wall of a building coming down. He didn't ask a single question, didn't pause for even 1 second to wonder why the room told a story that didn't fit the woman he'd married, because he'd been prepared for this moment for months. The watch, the bruises, the whispers, his own pastor's careful voice in this very room. All of it had been laid down like kindling, and the sight through that window was the match. He hauled Nadia up and away from his mother, and he cradled Ophelia against his chest while she sobbed that Nadia had been trying to make her take the wrong pills, that she'd been hurting her for months, that she was so scared, and every word landed on Marcus like the confirmation of a thing he'd been dreading and half expecting all along. Nadia stood in the middle of her own living room, soaked from the drive, her hands still trembling from trying to help, and she said the only thing there was to say. "Marcus, it's not what it looks like. Please, please just listen to me." And Marcus Bellamy looked at his wife of 6 years with a stranger's eyes and told her to get out of his house. She backed toward the door. She was crying, and she was shaking, and every instinct she had told her to stay and fight. But there was no fight to be had, because the only witness who could clear her was a small camera on a bookshelf that no one knew existed, and she could not exactly point to it now, not with Marcus like this, not with his mother weeping in his arms. So Nadia Bellamy picked up her keys off the side table with a hand she couldn't hold still, and she walked out her own front door into a storm that soaked her to the skin in seconds. And she stood there in the pouring rain in the driveway looking back at the lit-up window of the home she had made, and she watched her husband comfort the woman who had just destroyed her. Behind that glass, held safe in her son's arms, Ophelia Bellamy let her cheek rest against Marcus's shoulder. And for just a moment, just one, over the top of his bowed, grieving head, the old woman's tear-streaked face went perfectly, chillingly calm. Because she had done it. After all those patient months, she had finally, completely won. Or so she believed. She had no way of knowing that the instrument of her undoing had been sitting on that bookshelf the whole time, recording every last thing. The days that followed were the kind that don't feel real while you're living through them. Nadia moved into her sister Renee's spare room across town, the one with the sewing machine in the corner and the window that looked out on a parking lot. And she lay in that unfamiliar bed listening to the traffic and trying to understand how a life could come apart so fast. 6 years of marriage. A home she'd painted and furnished and filled with the smell of Sunday cooking. Gone in the time it took a man to cross a rain-soaked driveway. She didn't cry much those first days, and Renee found that more frightening than tears would have been. Nadia just went quiet and still, the way she did at work when a patient was slipping and there was a hard decision to make. Except now the patient was her own life, and she couldn't find the thing to do that would save it. Then the letter came. It came to Renee's address because Nadia had already filed the change with the post office, and it bore the return address of the County Department of Social Services. And when Nadia opened it, her hands started to shake before she'd read past the first line. Ophelia had filed a report. A formal allegation of elder abuse against Nadia Bellamy, licensed registered nurse. There would be an investigation. And Nadia understood, with the clarity of someone who worked inside the medical system every single day, that this was not the same as a bad breakup or an ugly rumor at church. This was the machinery. This was the state. An abuse finding against a nurse doesn't just cost you a marriage. It costs you your license, your career, the profession you gave your whole adult life to, and depending on how far it went, it could cost you your freedom. Ophelia hadn't just thrown Nadia out of the family. She had aimed a loaded weapon at everything the woman had ever built, and she had pulled the trigger. The investigator's name was Carla Boyd, and she was neither cruel nor kind, which was somehow worse. She was thorough. She was a woman in her 50s who had spent 2 decades looking at exactly these situations, and she came to the interview with a folder already an inch thick, because Ophelia's campaign had done its work long before Carla Boyd ever got the case. There were statements from members of Greater Faith Baptist. There was a note from Pastor Grant, careful and reluctant, but damning in its very reluctance, describing a decline he'd witnessed with his own eyes. There were the documented bruises, photographed at a doctor's visit Ophelia had been careful to attend. There was the account of the pocket watch found in Nadia's drawer. And there was Ophelia herself, frail and tearful and utterly convincing. A church-going widow of 72 with no conceivable reason to lie. Against all of that, Nadia had her own word, delivered by an exhausted woman with no witnesses, who when asked to explain the evidence could only say that she believed her mother-in-law had manufactured all of it. Carla Boyd wrote it down without expression. But Nadia had sat across enough hospital beds from enough families to read a face, and what she read in Carla Boyd's face was that the investigator had already, quietly, made up her mind. Nadia's hospital suspended her within the week, pending the outcome. That was procedure, they told her, nothing personal, but there is nothing more personal in the world than being told you cannot do the work that defines you. She turned in her badge at the same nurse's station where she'd worked 14 years, past co-workers who couldn't quite meet her eyes, and she walked out to her car and sat in the parking garage and finally, at last, broke. Everything she was had been built on being the one who helped, the one who could be trusted at the worst moment of a stranger's life, and now the official record of the state was preparing to say that she was the opposite of that. A predator. A woman who preyed on the helpless. And the cruelest part, the part that nearly broke something in her permanently, was that the people who knew her, her church, her neighbors, even her own husband, had found it so easy to believe. Want to take you inside Marcus's house now, because his suffering in this stretch was real too. And if you're going to understand the ending, you have to understand that Marcus was not a villain. He was a good man who had been played like an instrument by an expert, and the price of being played is that you become the weapon in someone else's hand. Carla Boyd came to him with a document. His statement, she called it, a written account, in his own words, of what he had witnessed the day of the storm and in the months leading up to it, an account that would become a cornerstone of the case against his wife. And Marcus sat at the kitchen table late that night with the pen in his hand and the paper in front of him, and he found that he could not simply sign it. Because a good man, even a deceived one, has a conscience that won't stop whispering. He sat there past midnight. The house was silent, his mother asleep upstairs, the rain long since gone, and Marcus went back through all of it in his mind, one more time, looking for the crack. He thought about the watch in the drawer, and how strange it had always been that Nadia, who could keep 100 medications straight in her head under pressure, would hide a stolen watch somewhere so obvious. He thought about the bruises, and how his mother always seemed to have a gentle explanation ready that pointed the finger without ever quite pointing it. He thought about 6 years of a woman who got up before dawn to make him eggs, who sat with dying strangers so they wouldn't be alone, and he tried to fit that woman together with the monster in the report, and the two would not join. For one long moment, sitting at that table, Marcus Bellamy came within a breath of setting down the pen and going to find his wife and asking her, really asking her, to tell him the truth. That was the fork in the road. That was the moment everything could have turned. And then he heard, from the top of the stairs, his mother's frail voice called down softly, "Marcus? Baby, is that you still up? I had another one of my bad dreams." And the sound of that voice, that helpless, grieving voice, pulled him right back onto the path that had been laid for him. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. And he chose, without knowing he was choosing, his mother's lie over his wife's truth. What Marcus never saw because his back was to the stairs, was that his mother was not at the top of them by accident. Ophelia had heard the long silence from the kitchen, and something in that silence had alarmed her, some old instinct that told her the trap she'd built might be developing a weakness. So she had come to the top of the stairs to remind him, in the softest possible way, of who needed protecting. And as Marcus bent his head and signed the paper that would help destroy the woman he'd married, Ophelia stood above him in the dark in her nightgown and watched, and her face in that unguarded moment held nothing frail and nothing frightened at all. It held the flat, patient satisfaction of a woman watching a plan come to completion. Then Marcus started to turn, and by the time he saw her, she was only his poor scared mother again, and he climbed the stairs to comfort her. And he never knew that for one instant he'd been looking away from the truth at the exact moment it was standing right behind him. Across town, Nadia hit the bottom. There's a particular kind of low that comes not from one big blow, but from the slow accumulation of every door closing at once. And Nadia reached it on a gray afternoon in Renee's spare room. Her marriage was over. Her career was suspended and about to be ended. Her name had gone out on the Greater Faith Baptist prayer chain, that supposedly holy instrument of care, as the woman who had abused a helpless old widow, so that even strangers now prayed for her soul, as if she were something to be cleansed. She had no proof of anything. Her own husband had signed a statement against her. And sitting on the edge of that borrowed bed, Nadia said the words out loud that scared her sister more than anything had yet. "Maybe I should just let them have it," she said, her voice flat and emptied out. "Maybe I should stop fighting. Everybody's already decided. Maybe it's easier to just disappear and let them win, because I am so tired, Renee. I am so tired of being the only person on earth who knows I didn't do this." Renee sat down beside her sister and took her by the shoulders and turned her so they were face to face. Renee was 39, sharper edged than Nadia, less patient with the world's cruelties, and she had watched this gentle woman absorb blow after blow for months, and she was done watching her fold. "Now you listen to me," Renee said. "I have watched you my whole life. I watched you hold Daddy's hand when he was dying and not flinch. I watched you go back into rooms other nurses were too scared to enter. You are not a woman who gives up because a fight got hard. And I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me like the professional you are, not like a woman they've beaten down." She tightened her grip. "You're a nurse. You don't guess, and you don't hope, and you don't pray it away. You prove. That's what you do. That's what you've always done. So I'm asking you, where is your proof, Nadia? Because I know you. And I do not believe for one second that you sat in that house for months watching that woman work you over and did not, somewhere in that careful nurse's mind of yours, start keeping a record." And Nadia went very still. Because Renee was right. Nadia had kept a record. Not on paper. She had bought a small camera 2 towns over on a rainy afternoon and set it on the living room bookshelf between a ceramic angel and a row of her late father-in-law's paperbacks. And she had told herself it was in case Ophelia fell, and she had half forgotten it in the chaos of everything falling apart. And it had been sitting there recording that entire room, day after day, through the bruises and the accusations and the storm and the moment Marcus threw her out into the rain. Every lie Ophelia had performed while she thought no one was watching had been performed directly into the lens of a camera the old woman didn't know existed. The proof was real. The proof had been there the whole time. There was only one problem, and it was a large one. The proof was sitting on a bookshelf inside a house Nadia was no longer allowed to enter, in a home now belonging to the 2 people with the most reason to make sure she never got near it again. Getting back into that house was the problem Nadia turned over for 2 full days. She couldn't go herself, obviously. There was very nearly a restraining order in place, and even setting foot on the property would have handed Ophelia one final, perfect piece of evidence: the abuser returning to the scene, unable to stay away. She couldn't ask Marcus, who wouldn't have believed her long enough to listen. She couldn't send Renee, a stranger to that house who'd have no reason to be there. She needed someone who already belonged inside those walls, someone whose presence would raise no alarm, someone who could get to that bookshelf in an ordinary, unremarkable moment and walk out with the truth in her pocket. And there was exactly one person on earth who fit. Tanya Reese. Tanya was the part-time home health aide who came to the house twice a week to help with Ophelia, a woman in her 30s, quiet and observant, who'd been assigned to the case months earlier and had kept coming even after the household went cold and strange. And here is the thing about Tanya that Ophelia had badly underestimated. Tanya spent her working life around genuinely frail old people, and she had known, almost from the beginning, that something about Ophelia Bellamy did not add up. She'd seen the old woman rise from a chair unassisted when she thought no one was looking, only to call weakly for help 2 hours later when her son was due home. She'd noticed the sedatives multiplying and the heart pills that never seemed to go down. She'd said nothing, because it wasn't her place and she had no proof and she needed the work. But she had watched, and she had wondered, and she had felt sorry for that daughter-in-law everyone was so quick to condemn. So when Nadia reached her, carefully, through a mutual contact, and asked to meet, Tanya agreed. And when Nadia explained about the camera on the bookshelf, Tanya sat quiet for a long moment, and then said, "I always knew there was something wrong in that house. I just couldn't have told you what." She agreed to help. Not for money. Because she'd spent months watching a woman get away with something, and she wanted, for once, to be on the side of the truth. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Tanya came for her regular visit, went about her regular tasks, and at a moment when Ophelia was settled in the bathroom, she crossed to the living room bookshelf, reached up between the ceramic angel and the row of old paperbacks, and found the small camera exactly where Nadia had described it, its tiny light still faithfully glowing. She slid out the memory card, slipped it into her pocket, set the camera back precisely as it had been, and finished her shift as though nothing on earth had happened. She said goodbye to Ophelia in the same warm, tired voice she always used, and she walked out to her car carrying, in the pocket of her scrubs, months of the truth. That evening she met Nadia and Renee in the parking lot outside Renee's building, and put the little card into Nadia's palm, and the three women stood there in the dark, not quite able to believe that the whole war might come down to something so small. But a memory card in your hand is not the same as justice, and Nadia knew it. She could not simply show it to Marcus, who might refuse to watch, or destroy it, or convince himself it was faked. She could not post it, could not weaponize it, because she was a nurse fighting to save her name and her license, and doing anything reckless would only prove the story that she was unstable. There was only one right door, and it was the one that had opened against her. She called Carla Boyd. She told the investigator she had recorded evidence relevant to the case, evidence that predated all of it, evidence recorded inside the home during the exact period under investigation. And Carla Boyd, whatever she privately believed, was a professional bound to follow the evidence wherever it led. She agreed to view it. And so it was that on a weekday morning in a small county office with fluorescent lights and a laminate table, Carla Boyd sat down beside Nadia and Renee, and slid the card into a laptop and pressed play. "I want you to sit in that room with them. I want you to watch it too." The footage came up in silence, that flat, wide static angle across the living room on Marlowe Street. And at first there was nothing, just an empty room and the light changing as the days rolled by in the timestamp. Ophelia, it turned out, had put her own mother in a state institution 40 years before, when she was young and overwhelmed and had no help and no money. And she had watched that proud woman die frightened and forgotten in a place that smelled of bleach and disinfectant, and she had never once forgiven herself for it. It had lived in her for 4 decades like a splinter too deep to reach. And when Samuel died and she was suddenly old and alone and dependent, moving into the home of a daughter-in-law who was a nurse, practical and clear-eyed and competent, the exact kind of woman who arranges these things, some terrified broken part of Ophelia became convinced that history was coming for her. that Nadia would be the one to do to her what she had done to her own mother. She said it to the photograph in that small, cracked voice. "She's going to put me away, Sam. She's a nurse. She knows how. She'll do it kind and reasonable, and everybody will say it was for the best, and I will die in one of those places just like Mama did. I won't. I'd rather be the villain than be helpless. Do you hear me? I would rather they hate me than have her decide when I'm too much trouble to keep." Then she pressed the photograph to her chest and she wept, alone, in the empty house, an old woman at war with a threat that had never actually existed anywhere, but inside her own guilt and her own fear. It doesn't excuse a single thing she did. I need to say that plainly, because it would be easy to hear that and soften toward her, and what she did to Nadia was monstrous, deliberate, sustained cruelty that nearly destroyed an innocent woman's entire life. But it explains her, and there is a difference. Ophelia was not evil for the sake of evil. She was a frightened old woman who had done an unforgivable thing to her own mother long ago, and who had let that old unhealed wound convince her that the only way to survive was to strike first at a daughter-in-law who, in truth, had never had a single thought of harming her. Nadia had opened her home out of pure kindness, and Ophelia had looked at that kindness through the distorting glass of her own worst memory and seen a threat. The whole tragedy, all of it, every ruined month, grew from a war one grieving woman started against an enemy who was never really there. When the footage ended, the little office was completely silent. Carla Boyd closed the laptop slowly, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not the flat professional tone Nadia had come to dread. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and I have a great deal of work to undo." The undoing moved faster than the ruin had, the way it often does once the truth finally has someone official standing behind it. Carla Boyd closed the abuse case against Nadia and opened a new one pointed in the opposite direction, this time supported by recorded evidence that left no room for a widow's tears to reshape it. She contacted the hospital directly. Within days, the suspension was lifted and the process of restoring Nadia's license was underway, with a formal letter acknowledging that the allegations had been found not merely unsubstantiated, but deliberately fabricated. Nadia read that letter 3 times standing in Renee's kitchen, and it did not feel like victory. It felt like being handed back something that never should have been taken, which is a different and colder thing than winning. 14 years of work, a marriage, her standing in the only community she'd known. All of it had been set on fire on the word of a woman nobody thought to doubt, and a piece of paper saying it had been a lie could not put back everything the fire had eaten. Pastor Elias Grant took it hardest of anyone who wasn't family, and to his credit, he did not hide from it. Carla Boyd, with Nadia's permission, showed him what the camera had captured, and the old shepherd sat through it in his study with his hands folded and his head bowed lower and lower until by the end he could not lift it at all. This was a man who had spent 30 years building his life on the idea that he could read the human heart, that he could tell the wolf from the lamb. And he had looked at Ophelia Bellamy and seen a lamb, and he had looked at Nadia and passed along the whispers that helped condemn her. He had written a note to the investigators. He had let his prayer chain carry her name out into the world as a sinner. And the following Sunday, Pastor Grant stood up in front of the same congregation of Greater Faith Baptist that had wept for Ophelia and turned its back on Nadia, and he did the hardest thing a proud man can do. He told them the truth. He told them he had been wrong, that they all had been, that they had judged a woman on the word of another and helped to nearly destroy her, and that they owed her not just an apology, but a reckoning with how quickly they'd been willing to believe the worst about someone who had only ever done good. Sister Della Mabry sat in her pew and said not one word. For once in her life, the woman with the busiest mouth in 3 counties had nothing to say at all. But none of that, understand, is the heart of this final chapter. The church could apologize, the state could reverse itself, the license could be restored, and it would still leave the one wound that mattered most wide open, because the person who had thrown Nadia into the rain was not the church or the state. It was her husband. And so Carla Boyd, having done her official duty, did one more thing. She called Marcus Bellamy and told him there was evidence in his wife's case that he needed to see, and she sat him down in that same small office in front of that same laptop, and she pressed play. I am not going to walk you back through the footage, because you've already watched it. Instead, I want you to stay on Marcus's face, because that is the whole story now. That is where all 2 years of this arrive. He watched his mother stride healthy across the living room. She claimed she could barely cross. He watched her tip her heart medication into a tissue. He watched her, with her own hands, press the bruises into her own arms that had made him look at his wife like a monster. And when the day of the storm came up on that screen, when he watched the real version of the thing he thought he'd seen through the rain, when he watched Ophelia hear his truck and drop to the floor and arrange the scene and turn her face to the window and scream, Marcus Bellamy made a sound that Carla Boyd would not soon forget. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was the sound of a man watching the exact moment he chose wrong, replayed from the one angle that showed him what he could have seen if he had only stopped, for 1 second, and looked at his wife instead of his fear. He had come through that door like a wall coming down. He had cradled the liar and cast out the truth. He had sat at his kitchen table and picked up a pen and signed his name against the woman who made him eggs before dawn, who caught him when his knees buckled at his father's casket. The betrayal in this whole story, the one the title promised, was never Nadia's. It was his. And now he had to sit in a fluorescent lit room and watch it, and there was no undoing it and nowhere to look away. He went to his mother that night, not in rage, though he had every right to it. He came into the living room where Ophelia sat in her chair, and he set the laptop down in front of her, and he played it, and he watched his mother watch herself. And here is where Ophelia, at last, stopped performing. She did not deny it. She could not. She sat and watched her own hidden cruelties play out in that flat, unblinking frame. And when it reached the night, she'd talk to Samuel's photograph, when her own small, cracked voice filled the room confessing the thing she'd never told a living soul. The last of the frail widow costume fell away entirely, and there was only a very old, very frightened woman left sitting in the chair. I was going to end up like Mama, she whispered, not to Marcus, almost to herself. I put my own mother in one of those places, son. I let her die alone in there. And I looked at Nadia, and I knew, I just knew, she'd do the same to me the day I got to be too much. A nurse. She'd know exactly how to do it and make it sound like mercy. And Marcus, who had lost his father and now was losing every last illusion about his mother in the same terrible season, had to hold two things in his chest at once that did not want to be held together, that his mother had done something monstrous, and that she had done it out of a terror so old and so deep that he had never once thought to ask her about it. She was still his mother. She was also the architect of the ruin of the woman he loved. Both were true. Neither canceled the other. He did not scream at her, and he did not comfort her. He did something harder and more honest than either. He arranged for her to be cared for, really cared for, somewhere with people trained to watch and boundaries that would keep her from doing this ever again, out of the house on Marlowe Street, with the truth of what she'd done finally on the record instead of buried. It was not the state institution she had spent her life dreading, and Marcus made sure of that, because even now he would not put his mother in the exact nightmare she'd been running from. But it was also not a return to the family she had tried to burn down to save herself. It was consequence with a thread of mercy running through it, which is about the most a decent son can offer a mother who has done what Ophelia did. And then Marcus got in his truck and drove across town to a parking lot with a window that looked out on nothing, to the door of his sister-in-law's apartment, to face the woman he had failed. Nadia opened the door and saw him standing there, and everything in her went still. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in a season, which he had. And Marcus, who had never in his life been good with the soft things out loud, who talked with his hands and listened with his whole body, stood on that threshold, and tried to find the words for the largest thing he had ever needed to say, and he could not find them, because there are no words big enough for that. He started to say that he'd seen the footage, that he knew now, that he was sorry, and Nadia did not fall into his arms, and she did not slam the door in his face. She just looked at him, this man she had loved for 6 years, this man who had made her eggs and thrown her into the rain. And the first thing she said to him was not about forgiveness, and it was not about the footage. It was the question she had carried alone through every one of those long months. The question that was the true center of the entire wound. "Where were you?" she asked him quietly. "When I told you the truth. When I begged you to just listen to me. When I stood in that driveway in the rain and looked back at you holding her. Where were you, Marcus?" And he had no defense, because there wasn't one. He had not been where a husband is supposed to be. All he had was the truth, which was that he had been wrong in the deepest way a man can be wrong. And the only thing he could offer her now was the rest of his life spent proving he would never be that man again. Whether that was enough was not his to decide. It was hers. And she did not decide it that night, standing in the doorway, and she was right not to. Let me take you forward now, past the worst of it, to a season several months on, because I want you to see how this settles, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than tie it up in a bow that this story hasn't earned. Nadia is back in scrubs. Her license was fully restored, and she returned to the ICU floor where she'd spent 14 years, back to sitting with strangers at the worst moment of their lives so they wouldn't be alone, back to being the thing she had always been, and that no lie had ever really been able to take from her, only borrow for a while. She is whole again, and here is the important part. She is whole on her own terms, standing on her own 2 feet, not because a man came back to rescue her, but because she saved herself, with a camera on a bookshelf and a nurse's refusal to stop looking for the truth. Whatever she decides about Marcus now, she decides from strength, and that changes everything about what her choice will mean. And Marcus has been showing up. Not with grand gestures, not with speeches, because he finally understands that speeches are the currency of a man who wants to feel forgiven rather than a man doing the work of becoming trustworthy. He shows up small and steady. He fixes her sister's car without being asked. He is there at the edges of her life, patient, consistent, asking for nothing, proving in the only language he ever really knew, the language of showing up, that he has become a man who looks before he condemns. Nadia has not decided. Some evenings she lets him stay for coffee, and some evenings she does not. And that ambiguity is not the story failing to end. It is the story ending honestly, because a woman who was believed over by everyone she trusted does not owe anyone a quick forgiveness. And the fact that she gets to take her time, gets to choose from a position of her own restored strength, is itself the deepest justice in all of this. There is one more thing, and it is the piece that surprised even Nadia. She is the one who goes to check on Ophelia. The nurse, the practical, clear-eyed woman that Ophelia spent 2 years convinced would be her destroyer, is the one who drives out to sit with her, to make sure she is cared for and not forgotten, to offer the very thing the old woman was so terrified she would be denied. She does it without warmth, she doesn't feel, and without pretending the wound isn't there, but she does it. And in one quiet visit, sitting beside the old woman who nearly ended her life, Nadia says the thing that is the whole moral of this story turned into a single act. "I was never going to put you away, Ophelia," she tells her. "You didn't have to do any of it. I would have taken care of you until the end. That's all I ever wanted to do." And Ophelia, who cannot undo one day of what she did, sits with that, an old woman who burned down a good life to escape a fire that was never lit, and something in her face finally breaks open into a grief that is not performance. It is not forgiveness, not fully, and it is not healing, not really. It is something more honest than either. It is the truth, offered anyway, to someone who did not deserve it, by the one person who had every reason to withhold it. Marcus stands sometimes in that living room on Marlowe Street, in the house that is quiet now. And he looks at the empty space on the bookshelf where a small camera used to sit between a ceramic angel and a row of his father's old paperbacks. And he thinks about how close he came to never knowing. About how the truth had been sitting right there in his own home the entire time he was busy believing a lie. And how the only reason it ever came to light was that the woman he cast out into the rain was, to her bones, a person who does not stop looking for what's real. And here is the thing I want to leave you with, the thing this whole long story was always about. The most dangerous lie in the world is not the one told by a stranger. It is the one you want to believe, told by someone you already trust, about someone whose only crime was loving you enough to stay. Marcus had a choice, in the rain, in that doorway, at that kitchen table with the pen in his hand. He could believe the person, or he could believe the story he had already decided was true. He chose the story, and it cost him almost everything before he learned the difference. The question the whole thing leaves sitting in your chest is the one he'll carry the rest of his days. When someone you love tells you the truth, and it's inconvenient, and everyone around you is telling you something easier, will you look? Or will you only see what you've already made up your mind to see? Because Nadia was standing right in front of him the whole time. She always had been. He just had to be willing to look.